Virtual Summit 2020. And we're here for 90 minutes. Basically, we're starting with a lab, legal innovation lab called Blockchain Governance and Crypto Law. And we're going to be elaborating the legal issues, concepts, and theories, and possibly even propose and review the crypto law and blockchain governance interventions. So far, we've heard incredible sessions. And today we might be going into deep diving into the topics such as the sanctions in cryptocurrencies, or maybe crypto constitutionalism, what the smart contracts are, the crypto legal ecology, and crypto maybe disempowered or empowered governance. So we have plenty of different topics that we want to address, and with us we have the moderators of this lab, that is Dr. John Haskell, Dr. Andrea Leiter, Anuj Gupta, and Vlad Zamfir. And I think that Morshed Mannan is yet to join us. Let's see where he is. How are you guys feeling today? Awesome, well, good. All right, so feel free to unmute whenever you want to. We're going to be having all the pools and breakout sessions. So maybe just to start to kick it off, the first question that I have for you today is whether you perceive the blockchain as commons. And we might go into the not into the blockchain group, but into the breakout rooms, just very swiftly for a couple of minutes, let's say 3 minutes each, to discuss whether you see blockchain as commons and why. And then we'll come back and circulate the discussion. Is that okay?
Sorry, 3 minutes each member of the breakout group, not 3 minutes for the whole group.
No, 3 minutes each. And we are going into the breakout rooms, let's say 3 by 3. How many of us is there? Yeah, 3 by 3, 2 by 2.
So we can 3 by 3 and then 10 minutes for a breakout?
Yeah, let's do that. Elisa, can you create the breakout rooms for us? Mm-hmm. How was it?
Hello, we were just getting started into a fun conversation where Andrea was, I think, saying something super interesting. I couldn't hear the last sentence. I would just want to hear. I know it will be out of context for everybody, but just the last sentence, it just feels she was finishing.
Okay, but you have to promise that we don't go into this after that in this room. We have to promise not to hijack the conversation.
I will just say we should talk about Dorkin another time.
No, yeah. No, the last sentence was I am a firm reasoner in dialectics. This is okay. So, but let's leave it here.
Okay, yeah, that's a can of worms, by the way. But okay, another time. Okay.
But that is a wormhole. I actually want to hear more about what does that mean.
I have a different suggestion. Can I have a different proposition? Because we had a very interesting conversation, Anuj and I, about the question of commons in the blockchain and what that is. And I think one of the things that we zoomed into was the question of the relationship between profit seeking and the idea of a commons, and if there can be or cannot be room for profit seeking enterprises in a common or in a commons structure. And that Vlad, I think, said very beautifully that Anuj said very beautifully that until 2017 or something, the idea of profit making was not necessarily so on vogue in the blockchain space, but then latest now with the DeFi, the pure profit seek has really become much more fashionable. So this would be, I think, from Anuj and Fabian in our room, we would put on the table what's the relationship between profit seeking and the commons, and is this mutually exclusive?
Oh, wow, that's a very interesting question. Do we want to kind of discuss and take some time to look into that? I mean, maybe people on this call have different opinions. What do you think, John?
Yeah, but maybe just other rooms,
like
one line or something.
Sure.
It's like I don't know. Like in the other rooms, I would like to know. We would like to know what you all talked about. So maybe a recap of the room.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Juan, do you want to take us into our room and propose or tell us something what was happening? Or
Jason and I were chatting with each other, and I sort of like forced it where I was just asking Jason questions. And like that's how it ended up being. he asked me a couple of questions. I diverted and sort of like got it back to being about him. And so sorry, Jason. And I don't want to speak for you, but it was really interesting. So Jason has done his SJD at La Trobe in Australia. And he has done work in scholarship on Chinese bankruptcy law and stuff like that, which could be huge in coming years. And he's currently based in Thailand, working as a lawyer with a practice at the intersection of everything from ICOs to bankruptcy to DeFi communities to new financial products at the blockchain space. And we were sort of like, our sort of feeling was that most of what we call, there isn't too many spaces right now in the quote unquote commons, which isn't for profit. And we were thinking about what those for-profit products are looking like in the next couple of years. That was sort of our conversation. Though I would defer to Jason if you felt maybe I'm mischaracterizing that.
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting quick chat. Kind of discussing how kind of the DeFi space, what's going to come out of it, what it kind of looks like. My kind of thoughts is going to be a certain kind of degree of centralization of DeFi products and projects to actually kind of get traction and kind of give it credibility kind of in the short term and then go from there.
Just to add to that, and then I guess this would wrap up our conversation, is one of the things we kind of got onto the topic a little bit is that it's hard to scale out without some return to some form of concentration or centralization. And we imagined that even if you decentralized, you would then have to standardize, and that standardization would end up with certain concentrations of players and areas probably having a lot of gravitational weight. So it starts looking like a new form of centralization again. And we were thinking a little bit about that, though it was very undeveloped and not with a value judgment attached to it. That's about it.
Yeah, it was a 6-minute conversation, so couldn't get too much detail.
So
maybe another time.
When you say there's no value judgment, do you mean that you're like not acknowledging the holy role of decentralization in crypto? You know, because normally that it's like heresy to say that like centralization is okay.
I think like the feeling was that even words like centralization are oftentimes rhetorical tropes that get passed around in debates, but there's so much work to be done to understand exactly what it means in what context. And we were just thinking that that would be a thing to explore more. And we weren't like sort of like using it towards a normative outcome yet, but more just trying to understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I would say that the decentralization is like its own institution in like crypto and blockchain, with like kind of our own little comments about what that means. And you know, centralization of governance of a standard is not normally depending, you know, on it's not a clear tell that it's decentralized or centralized, because like, you know, you have to kind of consider the alternatives and see what the choices are. And sometimes, you know, standards are a great way to coordinate, and it's normal that you have standards processes, and it's not like, and kind of the question about decentralization is more about ultimate control than about interim control. It kind of reminds me of the ultimate beneficial owner conversation in tax conversations, where like, you know, what matters is kind of like ultimately who controls it, not so much who in the meantime has access to this money or funds or whatever.
That tax question actually emerged yesterday as well, right, Andrea? I mean, it was a bit of a question whether the gas is perceived as a tax. And if, for example, we take into consideration that the blockchain might be a commons, then how do we actually establish, I mean, if there is no profit, there still are the costs. So how do we establish that the costs are being covered? And does that mean that we still need to have some sort of a taxing system in place so that people contribute towards that, and then, you know, establish a sustainable infrastructure? Oh yeah, there's a pool going on. So are commons and profit seeking mutually exclusive? You may answer that.
The size of the window is bigger than my screen and it can't find the submit button.
You'll be forever locked into the loop of the question, Vlad. This is your destiny. You'll never be able to exit this question again.
You know, as far as Zoom has to say, I think so. Like, I'm really having a hard time.
That's wild because I'm on my mobile phone and it was no problem whatsoever. I guess it's responsive, but not to Vlad.
You know, I think it's Ubuntu. I blame Ubuntu.
And Grace, how did you, what's your thought about the question? How did you experience it?
Oh, I think it's, so I think it is, the idea of profit is, to me, mutually exclusive, because profit means something that an individual takes rather than goes to productive use. So this is kind of a basic permaculture thing, or a basic, when you think about circular economy, like not non-waste economy. Profit means that you either took more, exploited something in order to have some reserve, or the reserve that you had, you didn't reinvest into something productive. So when I look at regenerative projects or projects that are belonging to a group, the idea would be that whatever left over there is, either we shouldn't have exploited someone or something in that way, or we should redistribute it among us or reinvest it into more actual productive capacity or social good. So to me, profit is against the idea of the commons. The idea of a commons is that we want to create a virtuous cycle where the commons is continually more, I'm going to call it continually more productive. So, regenerating nature is obvious, but it might be the same with regenerating some sort of technology to make it more and more productive. So anything that you extract from it, like profit, is by definition not being reinvested in something productive.
But so I mean, I totally agree with you on that, with the idea that like profit is not commons, like profit is exclusive almost by definition. But I also think that for-profit companies inadvertently contribute to the commons. Imagine, all you're trying to do is to make money, but what happens inevitably out of all the value you create, you can only end up internalizing some of it, and people end up contributing to the commons even despite their profit-seeking motives. Right?
I feel like that might happen inadvertently, but isn't the most likely outcome.
I just mean inadvertently. No, I think it's very likely inadvertently. It's almost impossible to make money, in my opinion, at least depending on how, but as at least the kind of person that I am, without creating like way more money for way more value than I'm able to profit off of. And so like, at least in my kind of creative role, I can't even imagine how I would make money without contributing to the commons, because like I do research, and so it's like, and that research, like I insist will become public.
I think that is probably true in knowledge-based types of professions. I mean, we're not producing, hamburgers or something, right? So if we're not producing something physical, I think that you're probably right, because you're always producing some sort of knowledge.
We're losing you, Grace, just a bit.
Yeah, we lost her.
But then in between, Juan is asking, is money an equivalent to value? And what do you guys think?
Well, I mean, this is a pretty classic economics no, right? There's this like marginal value. There's like this great marginalist kind of theory that talks about
company.
Oh, hi Grace. We just got the last half of a sentence. But there's this classic kind of reasoning that shows that like prices are related to marginal costs and marginal valuations or something like this. I don't remember the reasoning anymore. Sorry to bring it up. But there's classic reasoning, like even in like the most classic economics, that like shows or like reasons about like the relationship between value and price and basically no one treats them as synonymous in the economics discipline.
I would agree with that completely. So I think in my understanding of money, and I'd be really interested in what Andrea thinks about this through investment, but also others, is I think there's a fight going on right now about money. There's like a rethink happening, which has happened before that we just kind of forget about. And the idea is that money is a legal instrument that gets coded with different sort of social values. What we consider worth making money on, what is allowed to be invested, how it operates, who gets to be licensed to participate in that, how it circulates, and so forth. And if you think about it, where money comes from, money does not come from your basement, right? You don't have a printing press that's counterfeit. And money doesn't come just from a bank, right? Otherwise, a bank could never go under. It could just print new money. Usually, it has a backstop. There has to be some way, where does it come, And so there's almost like a hierarchy of money. That might be one way of thinking about it. So banks might produce a form of money, but usually that itself is working within an ecology, an ecosystem that's already been set up. And so there's right now a big fight going on at the governance level, thinking about the idea of chartalist state theories of money, which does not mean positivism, does not mean pro-state or something like that, but state theories of money. And underneath the state theories of money, how that works within the franchise of other types of money creation and how those are interlinked. In other words, it's very political. It's very contingent. There's lots of different design options. They have different stakes. You have a lot more policy space to do things. The whole Green New Deal in America is built on a financial argument called modern money theory, which is an account for how you could pay for it without having runaway inflation, versus other more traditional theories of money of the last 40 years, which are based on sort of like supply, the amount, Volcker and Friedman and all these people, which we see modeled in the law and economics movement, Chicago. We even see it in crypto with people like Vitalik and stuff like that, Buterin and stuff that come through. So right now there's more to it than that, but that's like one of the places where right now we're seeing a lot of fights, at least in the governance side.
So here's a question. How does cryptocurrency play into this conversation? In particular, I will note that there are lots more legal ways to spend cryptocurrency than there are legal ways to spend fiat. Everyone, and I want to agree with your take that this is, you can think of money nowadays as a legal instrument, a legal form, basically because everyone has different things that they are legally able to spend their money on. And, and also depending on the source of the funds. And so what you can legally spend on varies between person to person, and also depending on what kind of money you're using, what you can legally spend on is different. Like the stuff I can buy with cash, the stuff I can buy with a wire, the stuff that I can buy with PayPal, the stuff I can buy with cryptocurrencies, all very different. And some of it will be a function of my legal position, but some of it is actually the function of the medium that I'm paying with and the counterparties in that, right? Like PayPal won't let me pay for drugs or sex workers. Cryptocurrency will, cash will. It's like a different, there's like a different legal matrix associated with crypto. And then with this kind of more traditional, financial action task force enforcing payment systems.
Right, so that's such an interesting way of framing, Vlad. I'm with you. So I think two things that I think about with that orientation, and then I'm going to retreat. One is that I think of money as an IOU. It's a credit debt relation that has a form of obligation. There's other types. The wages of sin is death, but don't worry, Jesus died for you, eternal life, right? That's a different configuration of power based on a future idea, just like capitalism has capitalization, which is future present value. But anyway, money is an IOU, credit debt relation. And so anyone can issue an IOU. I could write to Vlad IOU on a piece of paper and ask him for any number of things. The issue is how can you get others to adopt your IOU, and then how can you, then kickstart the system? And so that's the first point. The second, so anyone can issue an IOU. It's more about how you create resilience and scalability.
So money as credit is totally like modern money, but cryptocurrency folks and cryptocurrency culture like super doesn't like money as credit. You know,
Well,
they're
it's
more into money as assets.
Any right. Well, any sort of like, it's usually a credit debt relationship still.
Usually, yeah. So most money is credit. I mean, I personally say cryptocurrency is not money because it's not credit. Like I go that far.
Well, for every credit, there's a debit. For every asset, there's a liability.
Yeah, I mean, not all assets have liabilities. Just credit assets.
I'm not speaking about property. If we want to speak about property and stuff like that.
Lots of assets are just like, you know, just pure assets.
Okay.
Like this super glue I have in front of me.
Just to the extent we're talking about money for a second, and we could get one thing that separates a lot of the cryptos, I think, from, let's say, state fiat money or how they're related to each other. I hear what you're saying, is that the state taxes you. That means that creates a requirement that you get that commodity, that currency, that token. So if I said at the end of this meeting, if you want the certificate, you need 5 Haskell bucks, suddenly everyone wants Haskell bucks where before they didn't. And so when a state creates the infrastructure of saying how you can settle payments, right? And they say it has to be US dollars, that then kickstarts a whole economy where many different players will start operating against that backdrop, right? Of that lender of last resort, of that coercive. So there can be lots of private actors who, you know, use all sorts of other things, but they're all backstopped by that system getting set up on that thing. So the danger would be with crypto, I think, that if China, for example, says, you know, because it doesn't have that backstop, if these players decided, which I'm not saying they will, to change the background institutional rules of the game, that could very quickly devalue that currency, because money is not ultimately its value based on exchange. It's ultimately based on these decisions of how it gets valued by these social configurations behind it, right? So if the central bank changes.
So what's the risk for crypto there? Sorry, I don't remember how. So you said the risk of crypto is, and then you went into this, and I don't see the connection.
I'm just mindful that I'm talking too much. So like, I just would say that one thing that's different between crypto as it currently exists versus maybe, you know, like the US dollar going digital as a digital wallet issued by a central bank with some sort of finance franchise of retail banks orchestrated in, is that has, like, for example, like that currency, whereas the US government, it could say, well, this crypto is no longer convertible to dollars, or is not accepted as taxes, or will be made illegal, or can only be issued by X person or certification, right? Something like that. That would radically change the value of crypto. I'm not saying it would disappear, but it would, maybe Goldman Sachs wouldn't want it as a trading desk anymore, right? They're not gonna have Bitcoin if it's been made that way. So there's, because it doesn't ultimately get grounded in it, that taxation, that framework of the broader system, it's susceptible to a lot more attacks and isn't really operating as much as currency as it is some form of investment asset, right? And then it's very much within the regulatory scope of existing transnational or international rule, you know, whatever we want to call that thing, to sort of mess with.
I do want to go back to what Grace said, because if it's no longer just the exchange of value and it becomes an investment, where does that fit in? Is that a profit or a reserve that, you know, somebody took more than necessary and is thus not going to be as productive for the whole commons as it might be if it would be redistributed in a proper way? How is that exclusive as well? What is our viewpoint on the investments? I mean, if money is now being used for the investments, go ahead, Juan.
Well, I think that the mistake here is that we see money as profit, and in order to see money as profit, we need to replicate the ideas of money, and we are not thinking about how human labor is waged in our current economical systems. And on the initial question of if I see blockchain as commons, well, I'd say I see blockchain as a tool that enables managing commons, but it's not a common itself, because commons are not designed by the human, and blockchain ultimately is and replicates like certain modes of domination, like capitalism. I mean, we are saying that making profit and on US dollars, but if we make profit on US dollars, we are also affecting third world countries, because that's the way it is. In order for the dollar to be the top one, there should be other ones that backing up and making these sub economies that we see in Latin America. So I think that that's the difference, and that's a very difficult point to compare natural commons and blockchain, because blockchain is designed by people whose ideas are behind the protocols, and natural commons are objective things that we all see, but neither of us like created.
Totally like that. My one kind of comment is that, like, you know, when you say blockchain is a protocol designed by people, I think it focuses on the tech and doesn't focus kind of on the ecosystem, which is completely out of control and completely way broader than the things that were designed.
I mean, people still think that the blockchain value is the protocol, but I think the blockchain value is the decentralized communities that are arising from it.
I'm not sure when you say blockchain is a protocol, because I mean, blockchains, you have many protocols in Ethereum, the proof of work, this, that, and the other. But to say the blockchain is a protocol, what you're saying is the relationship between all the different protocols and all the things that are not a protocol, it's ultimately another protocol. So I'm pushing back on that, because this kind of protocolism makes blockchain look like it's just a protocol, just like some bits and bytes. There's some informational pattern between computing agents, but it is not that really. It's much more than that. So, and also when you say blockchain is a protocol, maybe you are thinking of only the consensus and not the rest of it. And it's also arguable where the blockchain stops. Like, is it just the consensus? Is it just, because then you get into territories of like, should we only consider ether when we talk about all these things? Because if it's only consensus, should we talk about the dApp coins, you know? So I would say the protocol angle kind of makes it less clear, or maybe, you know, changes the conversation into a more human agnostic, just information moving, you know?
I would also be curious to hear more from what you said about this distinction between the natural objects and the blockchain, because I think that is something that, for me at least, on a second sight, becomes to be a little blurry, this distinction. In a sense, I completely understand if you say, well, the blockchain is human-made, but then on the other hand, if you really think about what we have in the world in front of us, out of us, a lot of our conceptual design of that bears upon what we take as objects. So I'm not a complete relativist saying there is no such thing as an objective reality out there, but I'm saying that nevertheless, the way we conceive of it and the way we frame it has a lot to do with the concepts that we build on it. And I don't think that the blockchain is necessarily that different to that, because it's still also made of computer networks, of cables, of material in that sense. And so the reason I'm bringing that up is because I think that when we keep these things together and when we think about them in the same way and don't take them apart, then I think we can make much better use of historical examples of the way we have brought our rules to bear on other things that we use together. And then it's not completely this new thing, this different thing that has to have completely different rules or operates differently. So but I would like to hear more of why you would make this distinction, or whether you think that's a distinction that should hold because it allows us to do something.
Well, I read this amazing book by Lewis Mumford that is called The Myth of the Machine. And it talks about how sometimes we think man-made machines are like objective realities. And sometimes we forget that in these man-made machines, there are always like, intentions behind them. So sometimes we make our systems like faster and scalable, but we are not addressing like or not using the real value proposition inside the technology, because if the real value proposition in blockchain is not only making money, as I said before, and I totally agree with Vlad. I think that the most interesting blockchain proposition is the decentralized community and the availability for us all to be connecting as peers from all over the world, and to be like thinking in this collective collective creation. I think that's the biggest value proposition, more than making money, because making money would like leverage on current modes of domination from geopolitics, like and to also like handmade agendas. So I think that the main difference between natural commons and the blockchain would be that natural commons are not created or doesn't have these hard-coded values inside them that makes them like virgin for our interpretation. But a blockchain is not virgin for implementation, because it has already an human action that behind the design of the structure.
So maybe the question is not so much natural or not, but whether there is kind of an active agency or intention behind it, pushing things in a particular agenda or a particular way. And so like whether maybe something is like a relic of past civilizations and used to be inflicted with telos, but like now people don't have intentions for it, and it fits more into this natural world where it kind of just is without purpose.
There's an interesting question coming in. Oh,
I would say
Grace, we're having trouble hearing you.
This is not working, Grace.
Grace, type a question in the chat if you can. We're having a lot of troubles hearing you. Meanwhile, there is a debate on the side in chat between John and Anuj, and I am enjoying that as well as the conversation that is happening on video. But John, you asked a question: can money be used in a way that isn't about making the money in private sense, as in making up money or profiting? I find it very interesting, and I would say that we surpassed that moment already in the history, but I am curious to hear more.
Let me reframe that in a way that goes back to a conversation Vlad and Andrea were having, I think, and that that touches on Anuj and Juan's sort of insights as people who all love Mumford. So I think one is that one conversation we heard that's been running through here is whether or not there is something called a real economy versus like a finance economy. I would propose there isn't, but I think it's very common to say there is. If there isn't, then money doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It could be for the public purpose, and there could still be private. But anyway, there's a question there maybe. Another question that emerged was whether or how you separate a quote unquote natural from stuff that's social or political. So, you know, can we give an instance of an example of something that isn't already steeped in background institutional rules, protocol, you know, like all that sort of stuff that we could see as sort of like beyond that. So that was sort of like two of the things that I was hearing in a lot of the ideas here. And I was just curious how people felt about that, whether from our existing speakers or Fabian, Lexar, or anyone else who wants to join in the conversation. Or Anuj, I'd be interested in your thoughts. Andrea.
Well, I feel you guys covered a lot of very interesting topics, and the way I see this all fit together, like before, John, you introduced basically the notion of money as a well tradition from legal tender, right? That you basically pay taxes with it, and if you trace that one back, it actually goes to establishing money to basically generate a market, so that well, basically emperors that wanted to invade faraway countries, so they didn't have to carry all the food over there, but that they could have a local currency to pay for their goods, and that kind of thinking actually underpins a lot of the back support of value, where we basically have the national security apparatus who says like, well, you know, on a national level we can just print money and you can trust that it's enforceable because we have the military, which of course is not a very healthy way to structure incentives, because it relies on threat. Then there was, I believe, from Anuj, this critique around protocols, and I would say that the protocols are not the actual solution, but rather they are the gateway to allow us to define mechanisms that can break free from that notion. And then the point that Vlad made with real world object, where he pointed at the superglue, I believe that is the direction where we need to look at it, and that's the potential where we can at least reach with digital currencies. I don't believe we're fully there yet, but we can begin to relate to things of intrinsic use value, you know, something such as computational power that has some kind of material component to it, because all the fiat currencies today, including the crypto made up ones, they cannot really bridge there. But if you want to deal with commons, right, I don't see that profit and commons stand completely at odds with each other. But if we start with the notion of profit, then you certainly end up basically missing a lot of qualitative aspects, real world aspects, if you always collapse it down to a single measure where you basically say, okay, I care about profit, and then, you know, for-profit healthcare is not really about health, it's about profit, and for-profit insurance and all those things, for-profit education. So I believe that we have a way of exploiting that aspect, that there is a material component to computation, and then say, okay, there is something that is at least valuable in every context where we interact digitally. Let's frame it like that. There may not be an objective agreement what that value should be, but we can triangulate through that. And that to me is where value comes in, because the value judgment should always be on the way, basically on the level of a human nervous system where the experienced value is evaluated. And any theory that depends on some objective notion of value will always be imprecise in the specific context and the situation that is applied. And to me, the direction that we need to go is precisely to break past this notion of having something that's generally valid and find ways, how can we, through protocols, build interfaces to the real world, where what counts is the outcome, the physical world representation, and then a notion of profit may be basically the derivative that has like some upside associated with it, but it cannot be the dominant criteria, because otherwise you basically disregard everything else.
I think when you said about the intrinsic value, there's something very fascinating, because if something, for example, has an intrinsic value, then it becomes challenging to use it as money, because, you know, we have the problems always, like in simple money things, when you use a nickel and it has more value than the actual thing that you get, right? So the interesting thing is not to have, and even in like computer games, when you have multiple currencies, always the ones that have the least value ultimately becomes the money in that game, because the moment something has a value of its own, you can also argue to use it for what it is, than just use it as a kind of medium of exchange or legal tender as an IOU. But at the same time, if you use a money, which I just said, which does not have intrinsic value, you are kind of incentivizing people to become obsessed with that thing. Because if, for example, money had any real backing, like, for example, our global warming or something could be saved, then you could argue some people would be like not just hoarding money in their bank just for the sake of money, because there's also another reality behind just the legal tender, which is whatever it is. So that's why in case of crypto, when you have, say, DApp coins, it's interesting because ideally some of the coins have certain service or something that is backing it up, but at the same time it becomes less good as the kind of liquidity that you get with money, because you also think of the thing that is backed. But at the same time, it kind of makes people hoard money and just obsessed with profit all the time, because there's a real reality that you care about nature, for example, so you don't care about the money. So but at the same time, I think the paradox here comes where even if something has no value, uh, like it just, you can use it as legal tender but has not backed on anything, because you will ultimately, if it is used a lot, the only value you will get is when you profit out of it, because you can't do anything with it. You cannot like eat paper money, for example, or anything. Then what happens, you ultimately make people become obsessed with it, and it becomes its own movement. I don't know, if that makes sense, the kind of paradox that I'm saying, like, should you have an intrinsic value or not? Like, I mean, you can argue both sides basically. I don't know if that was clear.
That was fascinating. That was super interesting. Um, what I had wanted to say about the commons, which really builds a little bit on what Juan was saying, as well as a little bit of what you were touching on, is that this idea of like the natural versus the blockchain commons, the thing that we forget about is that all the people, right? So this conference is a perfect example of an area where people are contributing, but they're not, you know, and we're certainly getting a lot back in knowledge. So where everybody participating in this conversation is both giving and receiving. And that's all great. And then we find a lot of people in the blockchain space who are doing something else, I'm included, in order to have just the money for rent. And so we actually are creating this system of where the commons that's valuable and the people, and that represented by the people contributing time, creating these kinds of events, you know, creating, there's all kinds of, you know, online forums. There's so much value in the network, which I can't remember who pointed that out as well. But that value is absolutely not represented by the coins or by anybody's ability to sustain the community. And I've found that in a lot of projects, and DGov is one of those projects, there's this burnout of the people who are actually creating all the value there, because they're not getting any money and they have to make a living some other way. And so I think that's where we're ignoring the commons, right? The commons is this tremendous amount of knowledge and time and contribution that people are making to the industry as a whole, but we're not recognizing that in any kind of sustenance value. And that's where that touches on that natural systems, right? There's this natural system called the human body that is getting not sustained by you know, by the system, again, depending on what you're doing in the system. So I think that's an area to look at. Like, what is this commons? What we say when we say the value is in the network and the value is the people, how are or aren't we sustaining those human beings as their natural needs inside that commons?
That is such a great, yeah, sum up, and kind of leads me back to where we began and why we even introduced the question of whether blockchain is commons. And hey, Angela, I'm just going to be giving you a very brief introduction to where we are at, or what is happening here. So basically, I asked the question whether blockchain is common, and I have not really provided you with a reason why I asked that question. So today we're hosting Guy Standing. That's a Dr. Guy Standing, and he's going to be, or he has a book, and he's going to be talking about the basic income. And the fact that I was positioned as a moderator is a bit interesting. I mean, I am very much against the basic income, the universal basic income idea, because to me, it's almost like, you don't make a fisherman out of a man just by providing them a fish. And to me, the basic income is basically the same. We want to provide somebody with an income, but then we don't really teach them how or what to do with that income then. So it's going to be a constant loop. That's how I see it. And I am very humbled to actually be the one moderating him and to be able to pose questions. And I do hope that he changes my mind. But another book that he also wrote was Plundering of the Commons, a manifesto for sharing public wealth. And starting to read that, I mean, he goes through all different aspects of the commons and then ends up the whole book with having a constitution almost for the commons. And while reading that, it was very clear to me that we could do something better with the idea of having a basic income and introduce that to the crypto communities. And this brings me back to what you, Grace, were just talking about. I mean, there's plenty of value being created by different people, and yet because that value is not having a value on the market, and because it's not being financially compensated, then people still need to kind of work on the side and put this type of a value created on a second track. And it kind of brings me back to the question, can we think of having a basic income, or can we think of having contribution models that are being based on tokenization? And this is where Angela probably comes in. Thank you for joining. But yeah, I mean, the interesting part of the whole thing is that no matter what we talk about, no matter where we go into, be it the commons, being the money, being the profit, being the basic income, we end up with a question whether we should be talking about the law or the rules. And the questions on the side, I mean, that's just incredible. Every path leads to Rome, and apparently every conversation leads to whether the crypto law is an overarching system or should we be talking about the rules?
No, it's not, and it's not a system or rules. I mean, law is not a system, and it's not made of rules either. But I would love to bring the conversation back to law.
Can I make an interjection before we do that? Just a mini one, because Angela, we never met, but I know of you. And I was very curious to hear what you said, because we had a conversation on value and the question of what does the price mechanism do to value? How is that if you try to appreciate something numerically? And since you are, in my mind at least, the token engineering person, I would be very curious to hear a little bit from you what your work and your experience has done so far, and how can you capture value in tokens? Does that mean that you have to have a profit logic? What happens if you put a number on something? Is that a problem? Is that not? So maybe you could just give us a little bit, and by that way also give us an introduction of you.
Okay, great. I was just starting to write, but maybe I do it better in words. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Angela Kreitenweiss calling in from Berlin. And I've co-founded the token engineering community. So this community aims to establish a new discipline, which we think is necessary in crypto, which is a combination of, okay, you have the opportunity to design new economies. You can apply tools we have from systems engineering, because obviously we are talking about technical systems, and at the same time we can apply complex systems engineering, so dependencies, interconnectedness of systems to the crypto sector. And the great thing about this community is that we have people from many disciplines, which I think is definitely necessary. So from social science, natural science, engineering, coming together, working on these problems. And at the moment we are running Token Engineering Academy, a course on ecosystem value flows. This is we launched the Token Engineering Academy in July. This is our first course. We are running it in a second cohort. And here we are covering the very early stage of designing a token system, which is defining the value flows. And this is basically touching on all the questions around value. And what I'm very lucky to have Shebnem Rusichka as the educator and designer of this course, because what we're trying to achieve here is not only discussing economic mechanisms we have at hand, for example, market making and automated market making, or a certain kind of consensus. But what we're trying to achieve is first start with, okay, what players do we have in the system? What stakeholders do we have in the system? And what's their motivation and their assets they bring to the table in the system? And so getting away from the pure, okay, you're designing incentives, monetary incentives, and some mechanisms attached to establish constraints and, let's say, try to avoid malicious behavior, but rather look at, okay, how can we think motivation, extrinsic as well as intrinsic motivations, and how can we build a system based on that? And the last step in this course will be designing stocks and flows. And stocks and flows are basically the fundament for simulating systems, which we consider as very important when building cryptoeconomic systems. So let's say a driver of our community is, okay, how can we make these systems more stable? And also how can we deal with responsibility and ethics in token engineering? And of course, we are looking at how can we establish a process and what tools do we need to make those systems as stable and secure for the stakeholders involved. And here simulations are pretty important, and also a great tool for really understanding the dynamics in a system. And these stocks and flows are, so our aim is to define stocks. It's like, those are the, I'd say, there you try to bring together the purpose of a system and how to measure if you have been achieving your goals. So the objective functions in a way for a system. And most of the times people define a system's purpose qualitatively, which is good, and then run into troubles or intuitively do the exact opposite when defining stocks, ending up with, okay, the number of users, ending up with the revenues, profits, and such things. So the things that are really easy to measure. And I think we won't get around measurable attributes of a systems, but we try to make progress in the direction of, okay, how can we better define the stocks, the objectives, the measurable objectives in the system? I don't have a final answer here, but that's some of the most important aspects of ecosystem value flows. And at the same time, we are at the moment working on TE Commons, which is our own token system for managing and funding token engineering public goods, research, education, the non-monetizable contributions, or perhaps harder to monetize. And here we are, of course, asking the same questions and discussing the same questions. Yeah, happy to share all kinds of links. Will do in a couple of minutes.
So can we try to talk about crypto law for 10 minutes?
I have a question, if I may. So I'm completely new to this subject and topic of cryptocurrency. though I understand a bit of tokens and how, like, that's exclusively from the perspective of a lawyer, when, for example, there is a digital influencer who uses his or her that, okay, fine, this company is trying to sell these many of its shares, and the selling of shares takes place via blockchain, let's say. So when you mention public goods, are you talking about something similar to this process?
I'm not sure if I understood everything,
I basically want to
because the sound
understand
was
what you...
pretty broken. Again?
Oh, so in one line, I wanted to understand how do we understand public goods? Is it yeah, that's it.
Okay, so again, sound
How
was
do we
pretty
understand
broken.
public goods? And
But
does that fit into I will...
Okay, I'm trying to answer, how do we understand public good? And for us, public good is
Wait, let's not go there. Let's
Okay.
leave this for some other time. This is supposed to be a crypto law and blockchain governance lab. And we haven't talked about crypto law almost at all today. We've only been talking about governance issues. And so I would love if we spend some time on crypto law stuff. You know, I'm sure you guys can find another time. Sorry, I'm getting frustrated at the lack of crypto law conversation.
So what's the crypto law question, Vlad? What would be a good crypto law question?
So a great, super relevant question to our commons discussion is, how do we have conflict about our commons? How do we resolve disputes about commons? Like, for example, we have disputes about, for example, immutability, the role of property and money in crypto. And these are, these things, immutability, money, property, and crypto, are kind of important parts of our common understanding of like what blockchain is all about. And we have this like, and if you want to dispute these things, you have like a real crypto legal problem on your hands. If I want to change the blockchain commons because some of it is criminal, I have a crypto law problem on my hands. If I'm, concerned about systemic issues that are raised by blockchain space, but the culture in the blockchain space, so super concerned about other things to the point where like they regard this, my concerns as like being like kind of less important or something, or like for example, the immutability thing is like a great example where like, there's lots of things that would be nice to have that we could have if we didn't have immutability, like people getting their funds unstuck if they lose them, like people having protections that they don't have today because immutability stops anyone from intervening with your adversaries or your attackers. These are kinds of big crypto law problems that are like super related to the commons question, and the commons governance questions, but particular, framed as legal questions as opposed to as governance questions. So, who right now is going to stop us or me or anyone from intervening in, the governance in crypto? Like, what is the law there? Like, what is how does it play out if you try to, say, violate blockchain immutability? Or if we want to change and if we want to question the role of money and property in crypto as like this notion of like Bitcoin is money, or that Ether is money, or that Ether is property, that Bitcoin is property. These are like some ideas. We have like a bunch of crypto law kind of topics. but you know, in general, there's questions about conflict. You know, how is the status quo entrenched? What does it take to displace it? You know, like how hard is it to dispute a legal form or legal norm that we have in the blockchain space? And if they're part of the commons, you know, like we talk about the governance of the commons, but there's also implicitly a law of the commons, where there's mechanisms by which conflict in the commons are managed. And so, you know, like commons governance is like not a very legalistic angle. Commons law is a much more legalistic angle. And I think it provides like a much richer lens, because law is always more complex than governance.
I mean, I really like, I think, Vlad, this has been for me, at least in my mind, for the past 3 days, I think that I just don't know exactly where this line runs for you between the law and then something other, because I really think that to my mind, the question of what vocabulary you use for deciding. So I think if I think now of Angela and the question of value design and tokens, to me, that is a fundamental legal question in a sense. If I wanted to spin this as a legal question, it would be about the question of property. It would be about the question of rent-seeking possibility from these tokens. It would be about where can they be exchanged? What does the exchange get for a cut? So all these questions would be in a legal design in a sense. Now, I don't want to throw us back, or I don't want to take away from where you want to go. I just think that I'm stuck in my mind a little bit in responding to your question, because I can only keep thinking that it depends on what you want to talk about, which kind of language you use for that, but you could talk in law about many things. So the dispute resolution, then at the question of dispute resolution, I think, is a very particular one. If you say, here is an example, there was the DAO hack, what kind of forum do we use in order to talk about this? But that is a zoom in to to this part. So I don't know if this is what you were thinking, or maybe I misunderstand you.
I think resolution is totally a zoom in, but I think to think about just disputes and the prevention and the possibility of disputes, and which disputes are even can exist possibly, and the culture that mediates all possible disputes and how they can go, and the way that we manage and prevent them, and the way that that's structured, kind of, for me, it really captures all of that I'm thinking about when I talk about law. And in this context, if you're talking about like disputes over property, or like, you know, the value kind of questions, it kind of seems more, it ended up sounding to me more like a economics kind of framing. For me, the law kind of framing is more like, what if token engineers are criminal? Like, how do we keep them to account? Like, how do you deal with bad actors, balance of powers? You know, there's kind of like the really tough legal questions about crime, you know, evil, terrorism, you know, money laundering, sanctions, these kind of more difficult conflicts that, you know, are super relevant to token engineering communities, even though they'd rather not talk about terrorist financing, even though they'd rather not talk about what if they're criminals.
But I'm sorry, I find your question very hard to digest, and I actually am of the opinion that if we're constantly just going to be asking, what is the crypto law, what is the crypto law, we won't really get anywhere. The laws are very broad, and they cover a lot of aspects that you just mentioned, talking about the anti-money laundering, talking about the KYCs, talking about the criminal aspects, talking about, for example, the juridical or dispute mechanisms. Those are all the domains that law can cover. And I have a feeling that we should rather, instead of just asking, what is the crypto law, really be asking, what are the domains that we want to cover when we are talking about establishing some sort of a crypto law within this community? Because half an hour ago, you actually said that crypto community is like almost, not that it's non-existent, it's just hard to comprehend, because there's
Also,
so many different actors.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ani.
Well,
I was thinking, just, it's fascinating looking at Juan's comment and listening to Vlad and this conversation. And having talked, having had really enjoyable conversations with Vlad, both intellectually and one of the things that seems to be coming up is that where all of us are talking about is like, we both are talking about those formal institutional backstops, right? But also we're talking about how within communities at all sorts of levels that organizational dynamics play out and are fought over. And those tactics and strategies and behaviors and norms, how they get developed on all sorts of levels. And rather than try to maybe name them, we're trying to understand how they operate. And in that sense, and that's one of the things I've really enjoyed with Vlad is sort of thinking about those non-completely formalized ways right on the surface that organizations and people have to operate. And an organization could be like a market. So it would be interesting to me, because I know we're running out of time, to listen to, like in our sessions coming up, if we even had sort of like, if people thought of case studies, a specific, like an actual instance where we could sort of like try to think through something, right? Maybe we could get into it and address all these sort of questions in an actual programmatic way. But I just wanted to say, I appreciate this. It's got me thinking now in a slightly different way about how I see us all sort of doing the same thing in a certain sense. I don't know.
I believe that the zooming in on the dispute resolution may be a very, very useful one, because it will reveal many things. Anya, I hear you, like with all these different concerns, but I would consider those, as complex as they are, almost like artifacts of, yes, when it comes to application, very much we need to look into these things in more detail. But what I see as a chance with what Vlad is raising is, basically, if you have a traditional legal system, it's too easy for crypto solutions to basically just evade the law whenever there is something that is inconvenient and gets suppressed. Then you just engineer something where you're out of reach. So to me, the only viable path is to basically engineer some mechanism for dispute resolution within the crypto system, so that we basically implement the things that we today may rely on in traditional systems. And then I very much am in favor to finding ways to find compatibility, so that we can be congruent and to the highest possible degree compatible with the traditional system. But I do not see a viable path where the traditional institutions can implement that, simply because it's too easy for crypto to evade. And then this kind of begs the question, when it comes to enforceability, whether it is a viable path, and this may be a dangerous path, but maybe it's a necessary path. I'm not clear on that. Whether we need to have some kind of enforcement mechanism governed by crypto law that basically goes to safeguard boundaries and all the way down to basically policing functions. So this is a highly delicate topic, of course, but
awesome. Thank you so much. That was great. That's great closing comment, I think.
So Anya, where do we go from here? Like, how do people feel? What do we want to be thinking about for tomorrow?
Sorry, let me unmute. I was making some notes on the side. Basically, these are the sticky notes, and they are surrounded around the topic that we started with, these blockchain commons. I was basically copy pasting what was happening in the Zoom chat, and there's plenty more to be added on top of that. And I very much like what you suggested, Fabian, starting with some use cases and diving into the dispute mechanisms, for example, just to zoom in and see how we, develop the topics around that and figure out what the crypto law really looks like when we are talking about disputes. And then we can jump from one case to another case. So having dispute mechanism as one of the assets that we talk about, or artifacts, and then having, let's say, KYC or whatever comes to our mind as another topic, another artifact. I might as well be very much interested in talking about whether we can think of the crypto law, as the meta legal studies, as something that actually combines all the rest of the legal domains, or should it be, segregated into domains like we have dispute mechanisms, we have criminal legal studies covered, we have the monetary policies, and this is also a law, and it still applies to the crypto as well. Let's figure it out. Let's start with case studies maybe tomorrow. I'll share these. No worries. I just have to figure out how to share it.
How do others feel about that as like a quick vote in the chat, or do people like this idea? I like the idea.
I'm a bit concerned that we'll be stuck on one topic and we won't get much breadth. Because, you know, like we kind of commented, there's so many different legal questions. And if we just get stuck on one, we're not going to have breadth. And I'm concerned about that. And that's my main reservation.
Yeah, fair enough. How about Fabian's idea about focusing on this issue of like dispute resolution and thinking of a sort of specific scenario and then thinking broadly about that? Does that?
Yeah, for me, if you think about not dispute resolution, but management, then it becomes broad enough to capture all of these different topics, because all of it is about conflict management at the end of the day.
Andrea, do you have any, I mean, this is, you're a doctor on this topic.
I mean, no, look, I mean, one of the things, but this is really something that doesn't, I don't know if that resonates because this is old. The thing that I do in teaching in my class for this is literally discussing the DAO hack with the students. So this is one of the areas in which we discussed, and okay, so what's the deal? Where is even the problem here? Where did the problem start? Is the problem the idea that code is law, or is the problem the idea that there is no mechanism that says this is how we deal with it? Is the problem that this is a very small ecosystem with a few players? So, but that, I don't know if that's, I'm not sure this is a good way to go. Maybe other people have better ideas about where to do this, how to do this. Vlad, what do you have an idea of what would be a good case? I am a fan of the case idea because I do think that it allows to get away from this very abstract in which you can make everything sound very good.
I like it. I like the case idea, and I like the DAO as a case, but I would also like to have a hypothetical case, like for example, some extremely criminal use of the blockchain that hasn't happened yet, but which we could think hypothetically about what would happen in that case.
Yeah, and we could also, here's an idea. If people have an idea of a case, like Grace just brought up Aragon or, you know, DAO hack, whatever, if folks could put together a short paragraph, sort of like unpacking that case study of just like as a Kickstarter. And when we come back, Juan, if you have something from Bolivia, you know, and if we could put that in the text, the chat window when we begin, we could throw those in there and maybe that would be fodder to jumpstart into it, something like that.
I mean, just to say also, I think Anuj and Morshed had some idea for the next session as well. So I think we shouldn't just completely hijack that.
All right, good point.
Anuj, do you?
Yeah, I mean,
let's just, no, please go ahead.
Okay. I mean, we are okay to go with the flow. I mean, no worries about that. I mean, what we were thinking initially was to talk about from a personal law angle and religious law angle. So for that, as a context, if it's relevant, you guys tell me, which is in the places where the English had colonies, which is everywhere in the world now, I realize that. But to be specific, in South Asia and certain parts in Africa, they have a system where instead of just private and public law, we have personal law as well. So which is basically kind of a compromise with existing laws. But what happened as a result of that is we have ways of doing dispute management where it could be enforced by a community, it could be done by a family. Every family has their own value system, for example. So there's a lot of like customs and habits and local practices, or you can get your local priest or imams involved and they can sanction some things. So, and there are limits to how much they can do and stuff. So there is a way to go about doing this where the state is not involved at all and it's still very much valid. And for example, in India, every time they try to stop this thing, as like rhetoric was always, we are not as advanced as those Europeans and Americans. What is this weird thing we have? Everything needs to be mandated by the state. It never worked because people just carry on as they always have. So we thought this is an interesting angle to talk about in terms of crypto as a personal law, and even the idea that when you consider a lot of personal law is based on religious ideas, which is also interesting because as you know, when you are, for example, a Buddhist, you're not an Indian Buddhist or a French Buddhist, you're just a Buddhist, right? So there's a kind of a global identification attitude that is there, which is there on crypto. Like you're not a French crypto holder or a Japanese crypto holder. You just hold crypto, and you also happen to be French and Japanese. So there's a kind of a intermixing between these different legal forms that are even jurisdictions that you have possibilities with. So we thought, I mean, this is just the tip of the iceberg, what we wanted to talk about, but we thought this could be a nice turning point because we don't see in the popular imagination crypto law this is talked about. Also because, I mean, I don't think people have, like Morshed and I, we have a background in the subcontinent. So, you know, we are aware of that. So we thought this would be interesting. That was the, but we are okay to just like, you know, do what everybody.